Thank you so much, Louise, for the generous introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And I really want to thank Drs. LaRose and Nicholson for inviting me. It's a great opportunity to talk to people about work that we're doing and hear more about work that happens here and compare notes and all of that. So yeah, what I'm going to talk to you about today is obviously early intervention, using a model that is somewhat different than has been implemented in other jurisdictions in Canada and elsewhere, but there will be many features that will be familiar to many of you. But I don't want to go any further without acknowledging many people who've gone into both the clinical work on which this program is based and who've been involved in the research. First and foremost, Dr. Susan Bryson, who is the Craig Chair in Autism Research at the IWK Health Center, who really was responsible for the design and implementation of this program, and I'll be telling you a little more about that because it's sort of an interesting story in itself. But she's also the co-PI on our funded research program looking at the effectiveness of the program. Helen Flanagan is a postdoctoral fellow with me who was a student of Adrienne Perry's at York Universities. We've been poaching from the Perry Lab quite vigorously over the past few years at the IWK. My graduate student, Kristen Fossum, Tracy Vaillancourt, and Nancy Garon, who contribute to the statistical end of things, so, you know, save our backsides very often. And certainly none of this kind of work obviously can go on without the participation of families, and we're certainly very generous with their time. The research center staff who do this work are exceptional, and we want to acknowledge them, and the clinicians who've implemented this program. And again, we couldn't do the research without the clinical program. The clinical program exists for the families, and the clinicians are the people who make all that possible. So, and acknowledging our funders, Nova Scotia Health Research Foundation and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. So I want to all be upfront rather than an addendum and glossed over quickly at the end, because really I'm the face, but this is where all the work happens. So I'm going to talk to you very, very briefly, because all of you I think probably already know a lot about early intervention and ASD. Then again, give you a little bit of the history of how the program in Nova Scotia developed. Most of the time I'm going to be talking about our data on outcomes for children, so that, you know, we can then perhaps talk a little bit about how that compares with other programs and what else do we need to know, and talk a little bit about some of the research we're currently doing and what we see the next steps as being in terms of research on our program. So obviously, you know that there's a very strong literature suggesting that early intensive behavioral intervention makes a difference for young kids with autism. And you know, I did a sort of fairly casual review of the literature and saw that there were at least 7 systematic reviews published within a very short period. It seemed like every time you opened a journal, there was another systematic review of early intervention. We look at the same studies and arrive at the same conclusions, providing strong support. And you're probably all familiar with the National Standards Report that came out in the US from the National Autism Center that provides a very thorough review of the evidence for behavioral intervention in autism. Then again, in almost the same period, there were actually 6 different meta-analyses, so analyses that pooled all the data and looked statistically at those outcomes. And there's even one paper that analyzed the meta-analyses. So really, we have looked very thoroughly at these data, and there's really no question that EIBI is an effective intervention for young children with autism. So, you know, we need to sort of go beyond that. We know that there is a model of early intervention that can make a really strong difference for a lot of kids. So you also, I'm sure, are familiar that most of the published outcomes, so most of the work that has been systematically reviewed, most of the work that's gone into those meta-analyses, comes from relatively small-scale programs, usually ones that are run out of university clinics or small research centers. And they more or less adhere to the original model that Ivar Lovaas put in place at UCLA these many years ago. And some of them are direct replication, like the Sallows and Graupner paper that came out in 2005, again demonstrating that yes, you know, you can get some very strong evidence of change for a large percentage of children with autism in these very intensive programs when they're implemented, again, on a small scale with highly specialized research-backed staff. But I think what people have been identifying for quite a long time is that community implementation of those programs is where we really have a challenge. You know, that I think all of you who work in these systems and all of us who read this literature know is that we don't actually have a ton of research telling us that the degree of change that we see in the research evidence can be attained broadly for kids out in the community when the programs are run on large scale. And I think what's really exciting is some of the best evidence we do have so far is the evidence coming out of Canada, and specifically the study in Ontario. And I think you were part of the original paper that Adrienne Perry was a lead author on in 2008, which still is the largest study of outcomes of EIBI programs ever published. You know, the limitation is that it's a retrospective study, so it was done, you know, from file review, but nonetheless, you know, it provides very good evidence that the vast majority of kids were making very good progress in those programs, and some kids make extraordinary progress. Helen Flanagan, who I've already mentioned, is currently finishing up a postdoc with me, did her thesis with Adrienne Perry, and she actually looked at a waitlist control in one of the Toronto programs, and again demonstrated that children who were enrolled in EIBI made vastly better progress than children who are on the wait list. So again, adding to that weight of evidence that we know that there are programs that make a big difference. So we move to the story in Nova Scotia. So I think probably anybody who lives in Ontario knows the history of how things evolved in Ontario. And so, you know, we do things a little slower on the East Coast. We wait until everybody else has tried it out, and then we see how it went, and then maybe we should try something. So, you know, and I'm being facetious, but, you know, families obviously were very concerned that, you know, things were moving ahead in other parts of the country following, you know, again, strong evidence that EIBI made a difference. Why didn't we have a program in Nova Scotia? And, you know, as with most things in maritime Canada, the story is always, well, you know, we have very limited resources. What can we do? We look at what's happening in, you know, Alberta or in Ontario and say, how could we possibly do that? We don't have, you know, an oil industry or whatever to resource these programs. So again, there was, you know, the usual, you know, strong and appropriate advocacy from families. And finally, it was in December 2004 that the Ministry of Health announced that they were going to fund an early intervention program for children with autism. But when they announced that, they also announced what the funding envelope was for that. And, you know, by Ontario standards, it was a very small envelope. So what happened after that, I think, was interesting and somewhat different than what's happened in other places. The Minister of Health basically directly contacted an expert, and that was Dr. Bryson. And she was asked whether or not she would be willing to consult on the development of a program. So instead of it being sort of run by committee or designed by committee, it was basically, you know, the one expert was asked to, you know, come up with a plan and submit a plan. And Dr. Bryson wisely put a number of conditions on her involvement in this enterprise, one of which was that there be an independent evaluation of the program. And that turns out to be rather an important piece. She also, you know, there was to be an undertaking that it would be a program that was based on evidence, but because, you know, we did have, I mean, I call it the luxury of coming on board a little later, we were able to learn from what had happened in other jurisdictions. And so there were a number of aspects of sort of the political scene that was playing out, as some of you would realize, in a number of places that we wanted to make sure we avoided. So what the model was intentionally designed not to try and be everything to everyone, but to be a model that would produce benefit for children across the whole range of autistic spectrum disorder. So sort of hitting sort of a priority area that would be likely to benefit children across the full range of functioning. Again, without attempting to sort of target everything all at once. So it was, the treatment model had to be something that was going to produce generalization, that was going to produce, again, sort of maximize benefit. And another piece that was really considered crucial was the idea that the program shouldn't sort of sit entirely alone and detached from the other services that were available for children with autism. Because I think one of the things that had been observed in a number of places was that EIBI programs sometimes exist in silos and other services are disconnected. And in particular, one of our concerns was that speech-language services not be running independently of what was happening in the EIBI program. And so in order to have a less intensive program and have one that would sort of maximize benefit for all kids, the decision was to look for a more naturalistic behavioral model. And in particular, we wanted to go with something that would entail parent training as a major component. Because obviously, if you're going to have less intensive involvement through direct services, the goal of involving parents more in intervention is that intervention will then be happening more throughout the day and will be more integrated into the child's daily routines, and that will maximize benefit and maximize intensity. So a decision was made, and again, this was based on Dr. Bryson's consultation with experts all over and her own reading of the literature. She really felt that pivotal response treatment was a model that would have many of the advantages that she was seeking, or many of the characteristics she was seeking. And the result of those deliberations was that there was a training contract with the Kegel group at the University of California at Santa Barbara, because they were the originators of pivotal response treatment. And so they contracted again in 2005 to come and work with people in Nova Scotia to get this model in place. So how many of you have used pivotal response treatment or read or been to workshops in pivotal response treatment? A few, okay, good. So you can correct me if I misrepresent it. It is one of the treatment approaches that was in the National Standards Report that I alluded to earlier that was recognized as an established, empirically validated intervention. It's considered naturalistic because all of the intervention happens in the course of kids' daily lives. There's no discrete trial component. There's no pull out of kids into sort of separate teaching. Everything happens, in the child's play place, preschool, whatever, in the home and the playground. The emphasis is very much on functional skills. So again, things happen in context. The intervention is all provided in context, which makes it functional. It's applied in play routines, in daily living routines. Again, never in an isolated context, never in a pull-out context. And one of the really nice things about pivotal response treatment is there's tons and tons of research evidence that these are strategies that parents and other caregivers, preschool staff, teachers can learn quite readily. So there are publications demonstrating that group workshop training of parents is effective. Dr. Bryson had a graduate student who did a case series demonstrating that 8 hours of training in pivotal response treatment was adequate to teach parents the fundamentals and to affect change in their children's behavior. So there are decades of research support for these strategies and for their applicability, their ease of use by a variety of providers, but most importantly by parents. And I've provided their website. Oh, and this one of the I would say one of the relative weaknesses of PRT in the past had been that there really wasn't a good written resource that really did a good job of describing what it was. I had read a lot about pivotal response treatment before the Kegel group came to Nova Scotia to do training. And I really didn't get it until I heard them talk about it and saw them doing it. But this new book that they've just published actually does a really good job, I think, of a much better job of conveying what this approach is about. So I do recommend it. And if you ever get a chance to see Super Nanny reruns, there also is an episode of Super Nanny in which Lynn Kegel demonstrates pivotal response treatment and teaches it to a family. So that's also a good way to get an idea of it. So the model that was developed for Nova Scotia with the Kegels and led by Susan Bryson was actually described in a publication that came out in 2007. And all of this work on the development of this model was done basically between January and June of 2005. I mean, it was an extraordinarily intense period. And the result was, you know, the description and elaboration of a model, and this paper provides the rationale for the model, which again has to do with, you know, what can you do with limited resources to maximize benefit for the most kids, and that's what that paper is about. So I want to talk a little bit about the design of the program, and as far as I'm aware, to contrast somewhat with what I believe to be some cases in Ontario, and this is information mostly provided by Helen Flanagan based on her study of the Toronto program. So there may be differences across Ontario, I'm quite sure there are. Critically though, in terms of the intensity of the program, in Nova Scotia, the duration of the program is, of the intense phase is 1 year. Children enter the program, they have 15 hours a week of one-to-one intervention with a person trained to provide pivotal response treatment in the natural setting. And the parents receive coaching up front, so that as soon as the child comes into the program, there's in vivo coaching of parents in that very first week. And then parents are supported to continue providing that, but an interventionist also either comes into the home, or if the child is in a preschool, goes into the preschool, wherever the child is, and they work with the child one-to-one for a maximum of 15 hours a week for the first 6 months. The next 3 months, that's titrated down to about 10 hours a week, and the following 3 months, sort of 5 to 6 hours a week. And then after that 12-month period, if the child is still a preschooler, they're basically in what we call consultation phase, which is sort of individualized support, but they no longer have the dedicated one-to-one person. It's more passed along to the family or the preschool or whatever setting the child is in. So, you know, depending on the age of the child at diagnosis, the age at entry into the program, they may be still a fair ways out from going to school. If they're diagnosed a little older, they may go straight to school after this intensive phase. But again, what we're calling intensive is a maximum of 15 hours a week of one-to-one, as contrasted with what I understand is typically 20 to 35 hours a week in Ontario and in many other jurisdictions, and obviously 40 or more in some places. So the duration, as I've said, is a year. Duration, obviously in Ontario varies as well, depending on the child's age of diagnosis and, you know, wait to get into a program. In the Flanagan study, it was a mean of a little over 2 years. There is no actual curriculum in the Nova Scotia program. It follows a developmental course, so that any child's program is individualized and uses sort of developmental milestones as targets, but it does not follow a set curriculum. The primary target for every child is enhancing their functional communication. So regardless of whether or not they're a nonverbal child or a highly verbal child who's using a lot of scripted language, the goal is to have them develop their language further and to make their language more functional. And that and the accompanying social skills that are such an integral part of communication, that's the target of the program. So it's not comprehensive in the sense of, you know, we have this set of targets in this domain, this set of targets in this domain, so on. I will show you that and the literature on PRT will certainly show you there are collateral benefits. So the fact that you have an express target of communication doesn't mean you don't see change in other domains. So I'll be showing you that. It's also really important, because of some data I'm going to show you shortly, that when I say the target is functional communication, the target is actually expressive communication. So there's no receptive drilling, there's no asking what's this. It's all designed to encourage the child to express verbally, or for a very few children using PECs, and I'll mention that. The teaching strategies are drawn, as I said, from pivotal response treatment, and certainly positive behavior supports is the general set of strategies used when they're there are atypical or maladaptive behaviors to deal with, and we've been very fortunate to have consultation and workshops provided by Dr. Joe Lucician from the University of British Columbia as an expert in positive behavior support to work with our teams, and that's been phenomenal. And my understanding is in Ontario, a range of ABA-based methods might be used. For some PRT, sometimes verbal behavior approach might be used, and for some children, discrete trial training. The parent role in our program is integral. So there is an expectation that every family starts out with the parents being coached to actually provide pivotal response treatment. But it's not that they see that as teaching time with their kids. They're using that as, it's modifying the way they interact with their child, really. So that they're using PRT strategies while they're having a bath, while they're eating lunch, while they're playing at the park. It's not separate teaching time. It's just life becomes PRT. And families like that, actually. And again, my understanding is in most other jurisdictions, parent role can vary. Okay, so pivotal response treatment is an ABA-based method. So the procedures are entirely drawn from applied behavior analysis, but the notion is that you are trying to harness the child's intrinsic motivation. So you're using the child's own interests to choose activities and to reinforce activities. So if you were to contrast it with sort of a discrete trial approach, where, for example, you might be wanting a child to learn, that this is an apple. You might hold up an apple, model the word apple, have the child try to say the word apple, and praise them when they responded appropriately, and do that over and over again. In pivotal response treatment, you would catch the naturally occurring moment when the child was going for the apple, you'd get control of the apple, and the child would have to vocalize or make some approximation of the word apple in order to get the apple in the moment. So there's no setting up of situations artificially and drilling things over and over again on the sort of adult's agenda. It all happens following where the child is naturally going. I'm going to show you an example that may make it a little clearer, but the difference is the way in which you harness the child's own enthusiasms, really. And the goal is that when it's all functional and all driven by the child's interests, that the intervention becomes more embedded in real life and more functional because of that. Yes?
What you just described was basically a difference between a man and an attack. So is it
yeah.
Based on manning, attacking?
Well, they don't use that terminology at all. So, you can watch and see. I mean, certainly, this is an example of a little boy, and it'll look more like a little boy when he starts moving. And right now, it looks like a blob. But this was one of the first children in the program. So when the program started, there were a relatively small group of families, and the families and the interventionists were actually all trained together by the people from the University of California at Santa Barbara. And it included this set of twins who were 5 years old when intervention started, and they did not speak, despite having had 2 years of private therapy of various kinds prior to entering the program. And what you're going to see is the interventionist using PRT to teach this little boy to request chasing. Now, this child and his twin were among the most socially isolated kids you could imagine, really paid very, very little attention to people, including their parents. So I wish I had a pre-clip of them, but I don't. But you'll get an idea of how this goes. So, I mean, you can see that the trial structure of that. I mean, it's quite obviously a behavioral situation in which, waiting for, the child waits for a prompt. Sometimes he needs the prompt, sometimes he doesn't get the prompt. He says chase, he gets reinforced by chasing. So all of the therapy is embedded that way so that, it's fairly obvious what the reinforcer is. It's chasing, and the reinforcer is related to the meaning of the word he's learning. So in terms of other features of the program that were somewhat unusual, it's that, again, I'd said that Dr. Bryson made it a condition of her accepting the contract to develop the program that there be an independent program evaluation. And that was actually through a tendered process. And I applied through that tender process, and I waived payment to do that evaluation and asked for the intellectual property rights to the data instead. And the government was flexible enough to go along with that. And so those initial data allowed us to apply for a CIHR grant to continue studying the effectiveness of the program. So that we got that funding from CIHR in 2007. That allowed us to build on the data that we had collected during the evaluation phase. We examined predictors, and we're going to talk about that. The province then, in 2007, decided that they would roll the program out province-wide. So trainers were trained by the California team to train more Nova Scotia teams. So we had Nova Scotia-based PRT trainers now. But again, this limited funding thing, there was only enough funding from government to provide the intervention to about 50% of the preschoolers who would have been eligible by virtue of their diagnosis. And you can imagine politically that was an absolute nightmare. And the bioethicist that we consulted, it was Dr. Françoise Bayless, who has a chair in bioethics at Dalhousie, recommended that instead of using a wait list to determine children's entry into that program, that it was actually a more equitable solution to use random selection from the children who were eligible. So a child gets a diagnosis of ASD, they become eligible for the intervention, and then when spots become available in the program, children were randomly selected by the clinical program to enter intervention. Anybody want to guess what the parents called that? The lottery. It was frightful. So you can imagine the public pressure. I mean, again, we had, an ethical justification for it. We had a research reason to do it because it was again, the decision wasn't made because of the research, but the decision allowed us to then gather data that really were in a representative group of children, not just children whose parents were good enough advocates to get them into the program, on a wait list. But you can imagine over those years that public pressure was building pretty dramatically because children did not have universal access to this program. So we published the first paper based on our initial program evaluation data in 2010. And the data at that point really were we thought quite remarkable because our less intensive programs seemed to be producing changes that were pretty comparable to what more intensive programs were demonstrating. And we think, pretty directly related to that, the following spring, they announced that they would fully fund the program. So in terms of, sort of the policy piece of this program, it's been a very interesting development where, instead of, the government agreeing up front to do something, they agreed to do something incrementally, waited for data demonstrating that it really did make a difference, and then rolled it out. So all far too slow obviously, for families, but a different model in terms of governments actually responding on the basis of data. So it's been an interesting experience. I'm actually going to a meeting in Toronto after this where policy around neurodevelopmental disorders and different approaches to changing policy is being discussed. So this is one way it's happened in Nova Scotia. And we're now, new staff have been hired and the program is now fully funded, and it should be the case now that all kids will get it. So the study I'm talking about today really is the follow-up to what we published in 2010, and this is looking at outcomes in a larger sample of children and looking at predictors of outcome. We published, although in our 2010 paper, we were publishing on the outcomes for 45 children. That's actually a relatively large sample, except for the Ontario study, which is massive. It's a relatively large sample in the autism EIBI literature, but it was a relatively small number of the children we've now seen. And we wanted to look at what predicted the children's outcomes, because there is some inconsistency in the literature. Higher IQ at start is something that virtually everybody finds predicts better outcome. There is some inconsistency in the literature about whether or not it makes a difference if you're younger before you go into intervention. I think we tend to assume that that's the case, and there are some studies that show it, but not all studies show it. And there's also sort of varied evidence about whether children who have less severe symptoms of autism make better progress in intervention. So we're going to look at all of those things. So in this study, we're looking at 118 children. They cover the full range of ASD. So our program, if a child has a clinical diagnosis of ASD, regardless of level of functioning, they're eligible for the program. As I said, it's a representative sample because these children were entered the program during the time when selection by the clinical programs was random from diagnosed children. As you can see, in terms of their age when they started intervention, the range was from 2 to 6, with the mean about age 4. The social responsiveness scale was our measure of autism severity, so we had quite a wide range from relatively mild to very severe. And the IQ range, this is using the Merrill-Palmer scales, on average the children were moderately mentally handicapped, but with a range from sort of profoundly impaired to average. And again, because we know that in virtually all studies, the age at which, the IQ of the child at the start of intervention makes a difference, I'm going to be showing you data split up that way because our kids do fall roughly into 1/3 who had IQs in the average range, another third who had moderately low IQ, and then about a third who had very low IQs, below 40. So the data I'll be showing you are divided up that way. Data were collected at the start of intervention, 6 months intervention for some of the data, and then 12 months, which is the end of what we call our intensive phase, our not very intensive phase. And what's important here is this is prospective data gathered by research staff. So these are not people who are involved in the clinical programs. They are people who are hired with research funds. So they have no idea what the kids' programs look like or what kind of progress kids are making in their programs. We've got sort of the usual suspects in terms of measures. We have direct assessment of children's language and cognitive abilities using standard tests. We have the parent interview, the Vineland, to look at children's adaptive functioning. We have parent questionnaires to look at symptom severity, maladaptive behavior, and parenting stress. We have a variety of other measures, some parent interviews that if I have time, I'll give you some qualitative data from those. And for the later subset of kids, we actually gathered some data using a videotaped play interaction with the child. And a student of mine has done some interesting work with that, so we may or may not have time to get to that. So all of the data I'm going to show you look like this in that they are organized by the starting IQ level of the child. So children who started intervention with a very low IQ are in this frame. The moderately low IQ group are in this frame, and the children with higher IQs are in this frame. Every line is a child, and that's start and 12 months of intervention for, again, each child in each IQ group. And what we have here is expressive language. So I told you expressive language is the thing we target. So the program explicitly is trying to get kids to talk or communicate. A very few kids went to PECs if they didn't make progress in PRT in the first month or so of intervention. The solid lines, the big black lines, are the average for that group. So the first thing that should be evident to you is that on average the lines go up. So over time, as a group, all the kids improve. These are age equivalent scores. Kids are going from that's about 20 months to about 30, 35 months on average there. And the other thing you'll see is that the lines get steeper as the IQ level goes up. So yes, improvement is influenced by the child's IQ level at start. However, neither age nor autism severity had any effect. Younger kids did not make more progress. Less kids with lower autism symptom severity did not make more progress. So that it was independent of those two things. But overall, kids are making large gains in their expressive language scores. And you can see in some cases really extraordinary gains, very, very steep slopes. So that's expressive language. So next we have receptive language. And I think the one thing that'll jump out there is it looks exactly the same as expressive language. When we went into this, the speech-language pathologists were very, very worried when they discovered that there would be no explicit targeting of receptive language. Well, how are the kids going to learn what things mean if you don't teach them that? Well, it turns out if you teach kids expressive language in a functional way, they learn what the things mean. So it sort of makes sense. And it's exactly the same pattern. It improves over time. The improvement is influenced by initial IQ, but not by age and not by symptom severity. So again, all these slopes are significant increases for the lowest kids, the moderately low kids, the highest kids, and they're making on average very large gains, but higher if you started out higher. So the rich do get richer. Cognitive ability. This is an interesting one. Again, look how steep those slopes are. So even the lowest functioning children. So IQ does make a difference. So that slope goes up. That slope goes up even more. That slope goes up extraordinarily. But even within the very low IQ group, there are children who are just bouncing off the chart in terms of their cognitive ability. And again, the other thing to keep in mind is, in this kind of program, when you do an IQ test with a child this age, those of you who do it know you're doing things like matching and sorting and pointing to things, and none of that is taught explicitly in this intervention. So none of these kids did a matching program. But when they were tested, their ability to do those kinds of tasks increased dramatically. And here, again, starting IQ obviously makes a difference. Age does not. Here there was a trend toward autism symptom severity, moderating the impact on cognitive ability. And it turns out that that's affecting only in the highest functioning group, the kids who are more mildly affected do better. But it's overall only a trend, so it's not a strong effect. Just a couple of other outcomes. The adaptive behavior composite score from the Vineland. So there's an overall measure of adaptive behavior, sort of daily functioning, social skills, communication skills. And here we're looking at standard scores, not age equivalents. So you'd expect typical developing child to be at 100. We get a significant gain from a mean in the low 70s to a mean getting closer to 80. So that is a significant, small but significant gain. Behavior problems significantly decrease, but one of the things that's interesting here is our kids, on average, don't have a lot of behavior problems. A standard score of 60 is barely in the borderline range, but the average score comes down to well within the normal range. So it's a significant effect, but it wasn't a big problem for our kids to begin with. Autism symptom severity, as I've indicated, is a somewhat more complicated picture. It's not a significant change, even though it looks like a decrease. But when you split it out by IQ group, there is a suggestion of an effect for the highest functioning kids only. So autism symptoms may only be affected, may only be reduced for the kids who are highest functioning to start with. Parenting stress, there is no significant difference. Now, you can probably think of some reasons why parenting stress might not have decreased over the 12 months, because what's happening at the end of the 12 months? Either school or intervention ends and they're not going to school, and what's going to happen next. So I think my interpretation of this is that there are new stresses at the end of 12 months. And again, this was very early in the program too. I mean, these families, we hadn't probably worked out as many kinks in what the support period looked like after the end of the intensive intervention. So one of the things we did do, though, because parenting stress didn't change, we were fortunate that we had also interviewed parents, we had interviewed parents about their perceptions of change in the family. And again, not in a leading way, just in what ways have things changed for you, your child and your family during the course of intervention. And a graduate student at Dalhousie, Laura Goodman, did a project with me in which she looked at all that interview material and did a qualitative analysis and identified what themes the parents were talking about. So absolutely, parents were talking about decreased stress, worry, and frustration as being a benefit of the program. So I love what one parent said, "I don't have to walk on eggshells." That was the change she noticed in her family with her child's gains in intervention. So these are the themes that parents identified. They were more confident in the way they were interacting with their kids. Sibling relationships were better, feeling more connected and happy as a family. These are things we don't get on standardized tests, so it's nice to have the sort of qualitative information to tell us that. Even the children's happiness. There was a small group of families who said that they had continued or increased stress. And again, we would expect that. Not all kids make the gains that we would hope in intervention. And you did see in some of those profiles, there were some that were flatter than others. So, nobody has the answer to fix all problems for all families or all kids. But overall, people are describing positive changes. So, in the few minutes left, I just want to summarize that, these gains were greater than we would expect based on how kids were functioning at the start and based on test norms. And that kids made gains in the areas we targeted, which were expressive communication, explicitly, and in areas that were not targeted. And the gains that we saw were very similar to what other programs report. So a gain of sort of 13 points in IQ in 1 month of intervention, 1 year of intervention is actually pretty similar to what the intensive EIBI programs report. Now they usually go on for 3 or 4 years, so they eventually may get up to larger gains. But there is really a lack of comparison in the literature of programs, EIBI programs compared head to head. And so I want to get to showing you a little bit of some evidence in that direction. We did see a lot of individual variability, and that's the way things are. Rates of change do differ based on how kids were functioning, but age and autism symptom severity in our program did not seem to make a difference, despite the fact that it does in some programs. So it's probably the case that who the kids are makes a difference. So we're looking at the whole range of kids with ASD. The Ontario program, at least from the published data, was from a time when only children who were more severely affected were in the program. And then a lot of the very early literature on EIBI, they actually excluded low-functioning children. So different samples in different papers can make a difference. And as well, different programs might be differently affected by the child's age. So although measured parental stress didn't decrease, many parents reported that they felt less stressed, and that's really what they feel is really more important than what the PSI tells us. I do want to tell you very briefly that a graduate student at the University of British Columbia has generously allowed me to share some of his data from his dissertation, in which he compared children who were in a program he runs, a group-based verbal behavior program. It's an ASD-specific preschool setting, and he had 14 children in his program, and we provided him with data from our data set for 14 children who were matched for age and IQ to the children in his program. And then he looked very carefully at these data. In cognitive ability, he found no difference. I'm just going to go through quickly because the statistics are all there, but trust me, there was no difference. All kids made gains, no difference between the two samples. In expressive language, all kids gained. There was no difference between groups. Adaptive behavior, they didn't change. These were a relatively low-functioning group. So standard scores in adaptive behavior, in neither group did they change. Problem behavior, there was no difference between groups. Problem behavior decreased over time. Parenting stress, same as us, no change over time. So His was also a relatively low-intensity program, but it was the verbal behavior approach, not PRT. The outcomes look exactly the same. So his suggestion is that these are both sort of viable models for community-based implementation. It's from a small n for sure, and it's a relatively low-functioning group of children, but there are so very few head-to-head comparisons that I think it's interesting to look at what he found. Partly because, for those of you who have read the review paper by Reichow and Walry, reviewing effectiveness of EIBI, they really come to the conclusion that what really matters is the fidelity of using behavioral intervention. Like, how well are people actually delivering the behavioral intervention? How well are the people delivering the intervention supervised? What's the sort of overall fidelity of the program? That probably matters more than anything else. And a very recent talk I just heard at IMFAR last spring compared to classroom-based early intervention models, the LEAP model and the TEACH model, and came to the same conclusion. They had no group differences over time in those two models. And what they remarked on is that the content of the programs, the teaching strategies they used, that the similarities were much more striking than the differences, and that both groups improved, no difference in outcome. So again, I think there are a number of different approaches we can be using, and it's how well we use them that determines how the kids do, not necessarily that the models themselves are strikingly different. And I just wanted, that group had reported that they intended to examine the costs associated with these models, which leads me to want to tell you as one last parting bit of information before I hope we have a chance to chat a bit, is that we have a newly funded study, myself, Patricia Murray from the Department of Health in Nova Scotia, and Dr. Bryson and a group of others. We're going to be looking at the comparative effectiveness and the cost effectiveness of early intervention programs in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Two completely different models. Theirs is a much more traditional EIBI model and longer duration and much more intense. We're going to examine children's outcomes after 12 months of intervention at school entry. Oh, I've got a lovely typo there. I before E, except after C. Shoot. And we're going to do a cost effectiveness analysis. We have a health economist from the University of Toronto working with us. And we're going to look at sort of what are the costs of achieving those benefits for children in different programs. So there's lots of other things I could talk about, but I will stop right there. Thank you for your attention.